a lot of people that, especially that I'm talking to in terms of like students, trainings and things along those lines, have never really seen or investigated a ransomware attack. So how can you be confident in something that you haven't seen before? And so if you've never experienced a high profile attack, developing those skills is hard. Gaining real world experience is just not really possible if you don't do that. But there are certain ways that you can take in order to become more familiar and also better prepared. And this is something that I want to share in this presentation. So first of all, we'll talk about gaining the knowledge, understanding what the typical ransomware attack lifecycle looks like. Also know what to look for in an investigation, because only if you understand what an investigation, what an attack looks like, it will help you so much more to be more effective during the investigation, to know what to look for, to quickly grab those artifacts that you need, that you just see over and over again in all these types of attacks that we're going to talk about. And then second is develop those skills. You know, it's great to read about it, it's great to hear about it, but skills training really only comes with like hands-on experience. So there's a couple of ways, there's labs, there's ways of how you can actually gain those skills, and we'll also talk about that at the second part of this presentation. Now, first of all, cyber attacks and especially ransomware attacks. This is, let's talk about the threat actor real quick. So organized cybercrime, mostly what we're talking about with ransomware, they target businesses because the entire motivation is the financial gain. So that's why, you know, there's a certain extortion or ransom that has to be paid that they're going to extort you with. And that also depends oftentimes on the organization's revenue, which is, you know, a pretty sophisticated way of figuring out how much you can charge and what's likely that a company would actually pay for. And this has evolved into such a big business model these days that there's groups out there that are providing ransomware as a service, which means you can use their ransomware and then do your own, become an affiliate and do your own things. And they just host a platform and all the infrastructure you need in order to really be able to use sophisticated ransomware, and also the whole coordination and infrastructure behind it that it takes to encrypt and to also provide the keys and everything. And they just take a cut for this. And that's why there's the concept of ransomware affiliates these days. So not every group is doing the attacks on their own. There's oftentimes different types of persons or groups that have the access to this ransomware as a service platform to orchestrate and carry out those attacks. And some of those groups that we've come across lately, actually over the last couple of years, you might have heard and seen about those, they come and go. And you can see which ones are the most damaging ones and which ones are just like most famous ones. They're still around. So not everyone is like retired. Some of them have changed names and moved on. So, you know, things come and go, but overall, the attacks, the number of attacks is still going on, and there's been a lot lately. And of course, they became more sophisticated. It's a constant cat and mouse game, of course, trying to keep up with the techniques and tools that they're using, and also being able to prevent and detect those. But this is just a chart from early 2022. So numbers mostly relate to 2021, but already you can see a huge number of victims that just carried out by a specific group. All right, so the next thing we can talk about is anybody kind of familiar with the typical ransomware lifecycle? Is anybody really familiar, has investigated a number of those before, that they can say, this is what they do first, second, and third? Just let me know, because this is the process that we're going to talk about and that everybody should be familiar with. Yeah, James, all right, yeah, we talked. So I know that you have seen and done these things before, absolutely. So here's the life cycle of a ransomware incident. So this is from the New Zealand CERT. They provided this pretty famous chart, which a lot of people are using these days as a reference. And I think it's awesome. It's very high level, but it's still so true that that almost every attack comes with like the same patterns that you can see here and follows the same kind of steps. Now, the first thing that usually happens is somebody needs to gain access into a victim's environment. And there is only a few things that you mostly are seeing out there these days. And those are why you just all the time have to deal with phishing emails, because The phishing part up here is the most common way of how attackers try to gain a foothold within your environment. So there's two ways. It's either, hey, somebody sends you a phishing email, you type in your password, so somebody might actually gain your credentials, and then they're able to access any internet exposed service, such as an RDP access, Citrix, things along those lines. They might have even guessed those passwords. Or the other ways that they might have, there's an exploit, and those, there's always phases, as we hear and see in the wild, and there's very likely that there's another 0 day or something coming up soon, because it always happens around the holidays, that there's a way to actually infiltrate an internet exposed service through an exploit. That happens sometimes. That's why it's so important to patch quickly. And then the second is the last one that we talk about is the email, which is also another way of phishing, but it's actually an email that contains malicious document that the attacker wants you to execute within your environment, so that the malware can then just do its thing and reach out back to the attacker's infrastructure, so that they can then, one way or another, gain control over at least the initial system that they compromised. So initial foothold is the target in this case. Once the goal is achieved, then we can talk about what's next. Oftentimes, this is something that threat actors do initially like in an automated way. So that's why you see so many campaigns such as TrickBot or Emotet phishing campaigns. A lot of these things are just being scanned or being sent out automatically. And then whatever takes the bait is going to be on a list. And people might even not just follow up on that. There's attackers that are in the dark webs, for example, are selling this kind of information, or attackers are looking for this kind of information so that they can get easy access or sell the access within a company's environment. So that's where you might even get a second threat actor into the mix. And from there on, things are getting a little bit more interactive. So that means after gaining initial foothold, they might establish their own command and control infrastructure. Oftentimes, and in ransomware cases, the majority of cases always evolves around the Cobalt Strike command and control framework. Now, if you have heard about it, you might know this is extremely popular. It is an extremely advanced program, so it can actually not just do command and control. It comes with a whole number of features that you can use to escalate privileges, move laterally, drop passwords, credentials, things along those lines. So everything comes out of the box within the tool, and it also has a pretty easy to use interface. So that's why it's pretty popular, I think, powerful and easy to use. Technically a commercial tool, but there's oftentimes those tools being used with stolen licenses, things along those lines. Now, once the attacker has gained a foothold, escalated privileges, and is able to move around within the environment, you can see here, moving laterally, escalating privileges, jumping from system to system to really find out what they need in order to achieve the objectives. And the objectives is not just to look around and see what's going on there. It's more like we need data, and we then want to encrypt the data, encrypt the systems. So first of all, data exfiltration. So there's file shares or any confidential information that is laying around might be something that they immediately are staging. So for example, they archive it in a 7-zip file and then try to exfiltrate it in different ways. For example, uploading it to a cloud host or something along those lines. Second thing is the ransomware part. So that's why it's often called double extortion, stealing data and encrypting systems, and then asking you to pay ransom in order to not have them release the data, but also to get back some the decryption keys in order to gain access to your systems. And that's where the ransomware comes in. So everything until here usually is done pretty manually. And then there's the ransomware piece, which can automatically spread itself within the environment if you got the right access. It can automatically destroy backups or, for example, shadow copies on Windows systems. And then at the end, finally, it encrypts data. And that's a part where it depends a lot on the amount of data that's on a system. More recent ransomware I saw, they were able to encrypt like a 50 gigabyte system or something within a couple of minutes, which is insane because that usually used to take like much longer, sometimes hours. So, if you see something like that even going on, it's probably still often possible to maybe pull a plug or to just shut down a system, or just somehow take a backup or copy files out that you need, because sometimes these things might still take an hour or two. But lately, the time has significantly decreased, so it's much harder to act as these things are happening. So this is now really the number one kind of high-level approach of what you see in almost every single case. And the reason is also because, you know, the objectives are always the same, and it's not like an advanced persistent threat that might want to try to be stealthy, look around. Like Cobalt Strike is also being used by advanced persistent threat actors, but there's like time is of essence, right? The more systems, the more environments that they crack, the more ransomware they can spread, the more money they're going to make. So they're not even necessarily trying to be as stealthy as possible, just more as effective as possible, and getting in and out as quickly as they can. So that's what we see all the time. And this is why it's important as an analyst to be aware of what they are looking for, so that we can, if we catch them in between, maybe even get ahead and then prevent further damage. All right, makes sense so far? Because if that all happens, and if we weren't like able to detect, then this is what people might see. And that's just for demonstration purposes. As you know, ransomware, once ransomware encrypts your environment or your systems, mostly the system, they don't touch the system critical files. So the system usually is still up and running. They just encrypt everything that's like of value, like Office documents, images, things along those lines. You get a nice little background, you get some instructions in a text file of what to do, who to reach out to, how much to pay, things along those lines. There's an entire support system behind it. And also with the double extortion, you might appear on the website, which is the client's technically, and then you see a countdown on how long it's going to take until you might see some information actually published, usually step by step, not everything at once. There's a little bit of negotiation in between sometimes. So this is just an example of the most recent one, which is Lockbit. And that's like we saw in the chart before, the most common one that's out there. All right, so this is what you get. Now, being familiar with the process, let's, as an analyst or a defender, let's think a little bit about what it looks like, or what do we need to know about what it looks like for a threat actor, for the threat actor themselves. And this is, I think, pretty important to understand if you want to do advanced investigations analysis, to just be familiar with, hey, this is what they can do, so this is what I'm trying to be looking for as well. And this is what I call the think like the attacker. And here we have the attack infrastructure. This is an image that we got from the Cobalt Strike website. This is kind of what they show us when it comes to initial kind of initial access. For example, you can see an infrastructure set up for a phishing email, a phishing campaign, in order to get a callback, get a foothold into an environment. So there's already 3 different servers, and it's not always just in the country, but 3 different types of servers involved, so that it's making it a little bit more difficult as an analyst or as a defender to detect those calls and the kind of network traffic to those servers. So the first one is usually, you get a phishing email sent to the target from some kind of server. That phishing email oftentimes contains something that makes you download malware. So there's an evil site somewhere hosting, having the malware staged. And so it goes back to the target. Ideally, the target then executes the payload so that we eventually reach our callback server, which means we have an established command and control communication. And this is where you can see the threat actors then jumping on it. Now, this is the initial step. And once we are in there, I was saying that, we might go more interactive. We might want to also establish additional channels, and there's for several purposes. So the additional channels are callback servers, what you even can learn on the Cobalt Strike site, because they even recommend setting up multiple different channels for the purposes of, if one goes down, you still have a couple backups. So the first, and this is why it's important for an investigation to be familiar with the concept, so that there might be additional callbacks, command and control server stages set up, because it's not just always one single command and control, and if you found it and destroyed it, that means that the attack is over. There's something called long-haul servers. So, for example, that might be a system or what we call in Cobalt Strike, we call a beacon, beaconing out back to the server every couple days. So this is your really like very hard to detect using different types of protocols sometimes, kind of communication that just is there for the backup purposes of, hey, if everything else gets detected and destroyed, we can still use that one to maybe set up another listener or another stager somewhere and then establish a new channel. Now, the staging server is something that is somewhere in between more like interactive and the long haul. So this is something that might allow us to stage certain tools on a system. It pings back out or beacons back out every couple of minutes or hours. So it's not too obvious, but it's still something we can interact with. And then post-exploitation servers, those usually have some kind of communication going on. They're beaconing out constantly, so we can almost interactively, for example, work on that system and interactively send your commands and retrieve the information you need from those systems. So those are the three different types of callbacks. And oftentimes in the investigations, you find that there is even more of those, especially more of those post-exploitation callbacks, because it's one or several people, usually attackers, working on that case. So this is why it's important to keep looking for different targets as well, different IP addresses or domains for those servers, because those might just they might be able to get back into the environment again if you aren't able to fully analyze or to fully identify all the different types of beacons. And so now we have talked about the beacon part, and this is a very essential kind of tool that comes with Cobalt Strike. So beacon is the name for Cobalt Strike default malware payload that is used to create the connection between a system and a team server. And in this sense, it's kind of like a reverse shell, because you want the system reach back out to us as an attacker so that we can interact with it. And this is literally the view that you get from Cobalt Strike, what it looks like once you have compromised a number of systems within a net environment. And this is as easy as it gets, where you can even click on a system and interact with it right away. And through a couple of really interesting advanced kind of technologies, and we'll talk about that. But this is really why, as an analyst, it's important to know not all the systems might have to ping out to the internet. You can chain them together internally. And this is what we call also command and control through the beacons. But there's a beacon that can, first of all, call out back to for example, our HTTP service to the internet, that they can reach us through our IP or our domain name, or internally where, for example, a compromised host might be communicating with other systems within the environment through a beacon, and those are based on SMB protocol. So you might see, for example, SMB beacon instead of a configuration that includes an IP address. You might see a named pipe name, for example, that is used to communicate between those systems and chain those systems together so that you only need a foothold to one system externally, but still can coordinate your attack across the different types of systems that have beacons, SMB beacons within the environment. So I hope that makes sense. But overall, as you can also see those systems in red, those are, you have like system level access, which means you can do pretty much anything right there. And so this is what, once you have gained almost everything that you need, like you can move laterally from any system. If you have local admin, if you have domain admin, and as you can see, there's power DC or there's a DC, there's a file server. So this is what they're usually looking for. That kind of means that they already like deep into the environment and have achieved their objectives. Now, as an analyst, again, the steps that happen usually is that we assume Jim Stevens here might actually be the initial cause for the compromise. There might have been a phishing email or something. In one way or another, they were able to move laterally from there and escalate privileges to system, and also from there find the file server, find the domain controller, potentially even getting domain admin access and be able to do anything they want, getting to exfiltrating files, and also executing a command that might be able to spread the ransomware across all those systems that they have a foothold in. And then there is also another connection. So that might also, for example, be a long haul beacon, so that in case this system gets detected or something breaks, we still have an option to get like back into the environment at some point and just see that we can fully complete our mission. So this is the initial setup and the view what it looks like from an attacker. Now, as an analyst, there's a couple of things that we want to immediately ask ourselves. And of course, as ransomware, with the nature of ransomware, it's always important that we first of all can actually identify the scope of the breach. So if we find out something is happening and the ransomware has not been executed yet, so we can totally go off and look for any beacons, for example, that might be within our environment to see what are the affected systems that we have around. Is there a piece of malware that we can search across the entire environment so that we can get as quickly as possible an understanding of which systems are affected? Are there critical systems affected? Which accounts are affected? Can we disable those accounts right away? Can we somehow make sure that we contain this ongoing attack at this moment? Because again, with ransomware, damage is only getting worse. So time is of essence here. And then the second question that always right away gets asked, especially from the legal team and compliance team, is what kind of data was accessed and maybe stolen? And this usually goes more into like a long-term investigation analysis, because that requires some more deeper forensic investigation. You first need to find those systems that were compromised. And then you second need to perform a forensic analysis to use different kinds of artifacts that might be an indication of what an attacker might have done on a system and which files they might have touched or even copied and staged and exfiltrated. And then third, what's the risk of ransomware? Of course, like you said earlier, we need to, if it hasn't happened yet, try to get on top of things and contain the spread so that the ransomware can spread or damage any other systems around in the environment that might not even have been compromised at this point. So this is what it looks like, again, from an attacker perspective. And I think this is just helpful for us to better understand of what it takes to chase down an attacker that might be deep in our environment, seeing something like this. So let's talk about a thing that is extremely important. We talked about beacons. So that's a quick thing, and I think actually let's do a demo real quick. This is something I wanted to show you because everything evolves around the beacon within Cobalt Strike. Of course, there's a lot more tools that you can find and see, but essentially, in order to move laterally, SMB beacons internally, or like HTTP or DNS beacons for external communication is always being used. And those are sometimes not even just dropped on as a files on systems, but just executed as like kind of PowerShell commands, for example, directly loaded into memory, so that you won't even be seeing much if you don't have like any special logging going on. And this is, for example, something you might be able to find in an event log. And this here on the left is an example of what a Cobalt Strike beacon looks like. So this is a beacon that is being executed in order to establish a command and control communication. And as an analyst on cases, you come across those, as you can imagine, every time when a system is compromised, when an attacker like moved laterally across it, there's always a beacon somewhere. And this is why the routine of decoding and decrypting this beacon code is so important, because we need important information as quickly as we can. And so as you can see down here, I'm going to demo this in a second, the beacon contains information that can help us to understand what the command and control server IP address, for example, was. So we can immediately take this indicator of compromise and search for it for any other systems that might have been beaconing out to this system, for example. Or you can even read here, there's a user agent string. So this is the user agent string being used to communicate with the HTTP listener on the attacker side. You can also search for that if you have logs that actually capture this. So this is what I want to show you just real quick, because this is a really fascinating but a very common routine for an analyst, decoding and decrypting a Cobalt Strike beacon. So let me go into our favorite tool for this, which is CyberChef. And what you can see here is this is the full payload of the beacon that we just saw in our PowerPoint. So it goes like this, and then at the end, stops right there. And we can immediately see that this is something that very likely looks like a base 64 encoded code. So we're gonna go ahead and can use CyberChef and say decode this from base 64. All right, so the first thing here is we can already see things are probably starting to make sense here. Couple of dots around, so this is actually something we can get rid of by removing null bytes. And so here we have the decoded version. So the first couple of lines here is something we can read. Then there's some gibberish, and then there's more stuff that we can read again. So that means here, this is the end of another payload that looks to be base 64 encoded. So here we have the evidence that it says, hey, take this code and decode it from base 64. All right, this is something we're gonna keep in mind, and then store it in the variable S. And then later on, you see IEX is for PowerShell, the command to execute this code, and to a 𝗙cie𝗹𝗹𝐺 stream decompress function, which means, hey, we actually first base 64 decode this, and then we also decompress it. So now we can do that in CyberChef as well. A couple different ways. I'm just going to copy this and paste it up here. And then the first thing I'm going to do is we already have from base 64. And then we have 𝗙cie𝗹𝗹𝐺. And voila. Now we have a PowerShell script that is actually readable, except until the middle part, but everything else is totally readable. Now, that means, and this is really what every beacon looks like when you come across them, and this is why we already, for me, I know exactly what it's doing, but just real quick to go through this PowerShell script is just taking the encrypted payload, which is shellcode at the end of the day, first of all, it's going to load a process, the process from memory, which is technically DLLs that it needs. Then it actually uses a function to allocate some space in the memory. And then it actually uses this shellcode to use the virtual alloc function, which is often used to actually inject the particular shellcode in memory. And then down here, it's going to get executed. So this is something that you can read up on if you're familiar with PowerShell and some memory internals. But one really interesting thing you can use nowadays, I know it's kind of cheating, but OpenAI can even help us here as well. So for example, explain the code below. So when you type in the PowerShell code, it can explain to us what it does. So it's just basically a PowerShell code, byte array. The byte array is being decrypted and then loaded into memory using the virtual alloc function, and then it runs, it gets executed. So the interesting part for us is what is the code that is being decrypted and loaded into memory. So to do so, one more thing that we have to do, let's focus on this particular part. We have this piece here, which is the decoded and the encoded and encrypted version. We also see, again, it's going to get base 64 decoded and then stored into this var.code _code variable. And then this variable is being used and XORed. So that's what we're going to do as well. Let's copy paste this piece. So get rid of the unzip. So base 64 first step, and then we can do XOR. And now the key was 35 in decimal. And so this is supposed to be what we are supposed to be able to read. Now, what you can see is shellcode, but here's the user agent string. So something we can take right away as an analyst. Again, it's important to grab those indicators of compromise quickly instead of having to wait for a malware engineer or specialist for a while, for example. So this is helpful. And down here at the end, you see IP address. Sometimes you can see name pipes and things along those lines. So that's the most important high-level information we can grab here right away. And this is how you quickly use CyberChef to decrypt a beacon once you find them. Now, again, just for indicators of compromise, there's more information involved. So what you can do now, since this is shellcode, we need to somehow find a program that can help us read shellcode. There's, for example, a tool called shellcode debug. So you can store this as a file and just run it through the tool, and it emulates the Windows environment. It even tells us then the IP address, the user agent string, the port, and kind of the function that it uses, so that we know it's using HTTP web client, it's establishing HTTP web requests and things along those lines. So there's a little bit more details that we could get out of this, but for now, this is actually good enough. And if you're lucky, but usually that's not so much the case because the contents of configuration changes a lot. But another way is performing dynamic analysis. And for this, you can put it in your own sandbox or in any.run. This is the exact sample that I was just using. Now, it starts with somebody downloading some bad stuff from a fake website, as you can see here, some JNLP stuff, which is, I think, Java related, so something more unique. But it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, we're using the browser to execute stuff. And then you see there's a FedEx.exe PE file dropped, executed, not a P file. And then here we got to the command, which we were dealing with now, which is calling PowerShell with the encoded payload. And then there's the PowerShell code, and then there's the PowerShell instance. So if we click on this, we can even say more info. And then here's actually the payload. And if you want to play around with this or copy the code, I'm going to put it in the chat. So give me one sec. Here's the link. You can play around with this yourself. I just saw a question was, how do you know that you have to use XOR after base 64? Let me get to this just real quick. So I have the code stored here. I'm just going to drop it in here for demonstration purposes. The indicator for this was that here we have our encoded shellcode. It says from base 64, which we know, so we can do the base 64. It then stores the output into this byte variable, this byte array, actually. And then this byte array is being passed into the for loop. And within the for loop, you can see that it writes byte by byte and XORs the content with XOR in 35. So this is how we got to this particular case. And it's the same thing everywhere. Like all the time with Cobalt Strike, I think I've seen just maybe 35, maybe not always for 35, but basically the same kind of procedure. Okay. So there's just one quick win that we have here when it comes to Cobalt Strike. And the most important one, because if you follow the beacons, you're kind of following the breadcrumbs in order to understand the scope, right? And I think this is what counts immediately, what counts the most, because it's such an important part. Now, this actually now leads us to other, what are the other things that we should be looking for? The skills that you need, as I was saying earlier, the tools that you should be familiar with when it comes to such an investigation. Couple things, that we talked about earlier already, and here you can see the MITRE tactics associated with it. Phishing, be able to analyze emails, phishing emails, and maldoc attachments. Maldoc is an Office document that has, for example, malicious macros, because those are the most common ones, like emotet, for example, that are always the reason why they initially actually got in. So second, then a lot of things can happen. I'm not sure if we can go through all of these, but persistence, local discovery, privilege escalation, credential dumping, that's just all the things that happen. And as an analyst, of course, there's a procedure that you can follow to do forensic analysis, to find the right places, the right artifacts that are indicative of what happened. But I would argue that if you don't know what you can do with the net command, or what Windows management instrumentation can do for you, or PowerShell even, or that Mimikatz, how to use Mimikatz and why it's used in every single case to dump credentials or credential material such as Kerberos, hashes, and tickets, and why you see LSAS processes dropped oftentimes so that attackers can crack those. That's important knowledge that you should have. And those are all things that you can do easily by yourself using Mimikatz, figuring out on your own lab how this works, using Mimikatz to do pass the hash, pass the ticket, because that's the #1 way to move laterally as well when it comes to Kerberos credentials. And then even how would you detect the process injection? In Cobalt Strike, you mostly see malicious processes running out of, for example, run DLL 32. And this is because Cobalt Strike actually uses this as the default process, but you can basically pick any process. It's just the default one, and most people are too lazy to even change that. So another thing that is a big giveaway, and a quick one that you might want to be looking first before checking out all the other processes. And then for discovery of the domain settings, AD-find comes up like almost every time. Use it, try it out, and just play around with it, because AD-find is amazing. And as soon as you see this AD-find environment, and even the output like stored in text files, for example, kind of what you might be dealing with even. And then lastly, the command and control, because that's where Cobalt Strike and for others such as Empire is another command and control framework fall under. You need to know what they can do with that in order to be effective in their search. Empire does not have beacons. They have something similar stages, but a different way of investigating it. So that's why context matters. And then lastly, the exfiltration, the way how things are exfiltrated. Oftentimes data is archived into zip files, 7-zip, for example, and then used through rclone or WinSCP to copy them out into an instance outside of the organization. And then lastly, the impact. So ransomware execution, for example, deleting data first of all, and then executing ransomware can be done in different ways. Some spread through a DLL that is being executed by run DLL. Some spread through 𝗙cie𝗹𝗹cie and other PowerShell commands, Windows management instrumentation commands, just using a bash script. And the payload itself for the ransomware might be staged somewhere on a domain controller, on a share drive that every system can access, download, and execute on their own. So a lot of things that go into a lot of different areas like sysadmin, knowledge, skills, investigative kind of forensic skills are needed, of course, malware analysis, all that comes together, and which I put into just this slide here that I think is a really important kind of a way, and maybe people like feel free to make a screenshot of this. Depending on where you are, this might be interesting to kind of understand what you might maybe want to be focusing on as a blue teamer, because there's so many domains and skills and knowledge that you need in order to advance. And I would actually argue everything starts with understanding a domain environment, understanding admin tools, PowerShell, sysinternals, because it's always used by attackers as well, understanding Windows system internals and injecting processes, and the security tools that are on a Windows box, out of the box, and networking, how networking is established. And then as part of fundamentals, but also a really, really important in any kind of area is how Windows authenticates and how Microsoft environments authenticate. And that has something to do with the LSA server service, LSAS also called, within every Windows environment. This is the process taking care of authentication. NTLM is a protocol, and Kerberos as well, very widely used, especially Kerberos in any enterprise environment. If you don't know how Kerberos works, there's no way for you to understand Mimikatz and pass the hash and pass the ticket. So I always make or ask my students to start off with setting up an environment like this and immediately to start digging into Kerberos and Mimikatz, because if you don't know how authentication works, you might not be able to find out how to analyze it, because passed hash is really hard to detect and does barely look different than a regular logon. So those are important indicators. And then when you move up to the chain, of course, intermediate skills, everything goes around the forensic process, Windows forensics, malware analysis. If you're lucky, you have network traffic, even where you can perform analysis, or in the cloud nowadays, a whole nother domain. But on the advanced side, this is what I think is just so cool, where if you understand the defensive side, going into the red team attack operations, understanding the tools using Cobalt Strike, or maybe even PowerShell Empire, or just called Empire these days because it's free, is a really huge benefit that you can just learn from a lot. So a couple things that I pointed out here, and let me see how much time we have left so that we can now also point out a couple of ways of how you can actually, now since you know what to look for or what to study on, how you can actually do that. So training lab setup. I am a huge fan of just everything hands-on, right? I mean, you have to read up and gain knowledge about certain things, but a lab setup is such a critical thing nowadays. And just to learn the fundamentals, it can be as easy as this down here on the left. Just setting up a domain controller, a Windows box, can be all done for free. I have a tutorial on my website, and just play around with this environment, figure out how Kerberos works, drop Mimikatz on this machine, try to play around obtaining some hashes that you can use. This is really, I think, a really great start. And when you're getting more into the advanced side of things, of course, then you want to look into a more like enterprise realistic environment. Still based on the same concept, but additional tools, right? So for example, there is something called the Detection Lab, a couple other frameworks out there, which is just a framework that allows you, based on Terraform, for example, or Ansible actually, and Vagrant scripts, that allows you to set up this kind of environment automatically. So you just basically write a command, and it sets up all these systems on a, for example, Azure environment or in an AWS environment. So you get a Windows box, you get two Windows servers. One is a domain controller, the other one has a couple other functions. For example, event log collectors, and pushing them into our central, what they call logger, which is running all the tools that we want as an incident responder. So for example, for me, I'm starting at the bottom because I think those are almost like the priorities. You want to use a tool that simulates or has the capabilities of an EDR. And the closest as it gets with open source these days is 𝗙ecie𝗹𝗹cie. It's amazing. You can perform basically forensic analysis, data-driven analysis, picking and choosing the artifacts you want to look for at scale across every system by using 𝗙ecie𝗹𝗹cie, because there's an agent in every system, and it just queries the agents and gets you back the information you need, where you can perform some initial analysis. It's amazing for scoping, and then you can use and pick and choose those systems that might actually show some suspicious signs, and use them for like running collections, data collections out of it, and use the collections for a deeper analysis. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is, of course, you want to use event logs. Every environment typically has a SIEM or some kind of central logging repository. So Splunk comes pre-configured out of the box with this setup, something that you want to use interchangeably, Splunk and 𝗙ecie𝗹𝗹cie. Those are the two things you want to use for the investigation. And once you have determined what happened, you go into the Windows, or you go into the forensics, you start the forensics process and go into data collection and imaging potentially, and then performing more like a manual analysis, however deep you want to go. And this basically replicates or simulates a pretty decent enterprise environment. And we haven't even talked about some of the network and traffic analysis capabilities here. So this is, I think, a really cool setup. And how can you carry out those attacks so that you have something to investigate? People who have taken the forensics course know about Atomic Red Team and what it can do. We basically built a script with Atomic Red Team that simulates a compromise on the Windows system using realistic attack techniques, which we then investigate. So this is Atomic Red Team. It's also open source, and you can basically build a script, or you can execute the attacks that we talked about up here. So these tactics and techniques is something that you can then just apply within your Atomic Red Team setup, and then be able to, a lot of people use it for detection engineering, but also for skills training. You can do the same thing here. And if you want to go really far into the weeds, then you want to apply your own hands-on attack. And this is, like I said, Cobalt Strike is hard to get a hold of because it's expensive, but there is Empire out there, which is basically the same thing, similar framework, I should say, not the same, but also used by ransomware and APT groups alike. So this is, for example, the process that I would use if I had set up an attack and investigation scenario where I really need to manually create a realistic scenario that I then want to take and investigate from an analysis perspective. So you start with delivering a payload. So in this case, instead of a beacon, it's called a stager in Empire. So you drop a stager, and once you get a foothold of the Windows system, you perform the local recon, the enumeration about the local user accounts, about the tasks that are running, potentially disabling certain things. You create a scheduled task to initially get some persistence. Now, elevate privileges. There's tools in Empire that can do that for you, depending on the system setup. Another persistence with elevated privileges, with, for example, using registry keys, process injections, just like Cobalt Strike does with run DLL32. You inject it to another process to perform defensive evasion. You go into the domain reconnaissance. You just use AD-Find. AD-Find is such a cool tool that you really want to maybe learn more about to understand what it can do, the capabilities. And once you have mapped out the domain, you ideally are able to dump credentials using mimikatz from a memory, for example, and use those credentials, for example, the hashes, to perform a lateral move past the hash attack, or a lateral movement using past the hash to the domain controller. And that's where we conclude the ransomware attack, for example, simulating exfiltration with files, for example, using 7-zip through the command line, download 7-zip, archive the files, and use a download rclone and just copy it somewhere else. You get those logs into your event logs. You'll get those artifacts into your Windows box that you can use to analyze with Velociraptor. Same thing for the ransomware. So just execute a bash file. There's no need to really encrypt stuff. Using post-exploitation to do so, which is what the attacker do. So you get the full chain, which you can do entirely by yourself. And this is basically what we teach and preach with our students, and what we are working on as well. And if you want to do this as well through my guidance and through our master program, I do have a program out there, and it's basically this and a lot of more of these things that we just learned about. And this is where I work with individuals, also corporates and teams, creating cohorts where we go through a long-term kind of relationship, because we really want to train up from the fundamentals to the intermediate to the advanced kind of skills that you need to understand, so that you can immediately be more effective, and you can learn things that you might have not even seen before, or that you're worried about that you might miss out on. Cool. All right, then. Thank you very much. And I'll reach out with the additional links and potentially the recording. Once it's up there, at least, I'll keep you posted. Thank you very much.